My name is Jennifer Tegenye. Today is April 2nd, 2023, and I'm here with Catlyn as part of the Chicago Youth Movement's Oral History Project. Hi, Catlyn. Thank you so much for joining me today. Do I have your permission to record this interview?
Yes.
Awesome. So, Catlyn, if we could just start with you telling me a bit about your childhood, where you grew up, and what your family dynamic is like.
So I had a very diverse childhood, given the fact that my mom had me when she was 16. And so I really got to experience the different branches of my family. My primary caregiver is my aunt, my guardian, who alongside when I was like a baby would take care of me with my grandma. Um, so it was my great aunt and her sister basically. And I grew up on 81st and Harper. And, this is definitely, I think, a Black experience when you are from Chicago, but I got moved around due to like Section 8 and affordable housing. So a little bit of my childhood I spent in Iowa and Minnesota as well. But was always a Chicago baby. My aunt grew up in the Robert Taylors and went to DuSable, and as well as my grandma. My other aunt was a teacher, I believe, at I don't know, it's over, I forget what that school's called, but I think, yeah, so I grew up around there. And then when we got back to Chicago, I ended up staying with my godparents who live in the Beverly area, and I went to Chicago Public Schools, and would walk to school, um, oh, or get driven to school. I think my childhood definitely shapes who I am today because I got to experience those different branches of and walks of life. At some point, I lived in the suburbs. And then too, at some point, I stayed with my birth mom for the first time in my life, who lived in Parkway. So I experienced that like intercommunal violence and that trauma like firsthand. And I think that is definitely something that has radicalized me, because that was at the peak of my organizing, I would say. And so I would be going to protest, and I would be going to these like panels and speaking at events, and then would go home and would be the most harmed and impacted. So whatever I was saying there, like my voice and my experience was always the most essential. And it's so easy to like overlook and be labeled as one thing because of your background. And I think that it's easy for people to do that to me, and it always has been. Because going to school in Beverly was also an experience as well for me, like having to adapt and see a lifestyle that like I couldn't really relate to. But then going back to the projects, and then, having labels put on me at school, even now, like people think that I'm privileged and can have like, just because my vocabulary, and I have to stop people and explain to them sometimes that while my story is not something that I have to explain to you, like I have struggled as well. And I think that because I am in a position where at one time in my life, like it was not so easy to have access to food. Like there were days where we would skip meals because we didn't have the money for it. Or like there were days where I would have to feed my little siblings and make sure that they got home from school. And so I think that key experience, like which was last year, I think has made me grateful for certain things, but also shifts the way that I look at how other people need things. Because while I'm not the first person to need access to food or clothes or shelter or housing or whatever the case may be, I now have that idea and I have that experience when I walk into a room with people who forget and oftentimes leave us of those who go through those experiences behind.
Yeah, I think that's very powerful. Could you like tell me a bit more about what it was like what Beverly is like, for those who are not familiar with that, and I guess like the transition to your current school and like, yeah, all of that stuff.
So growing up in Beverly as a kid, it was nothing. It was like usual, you know. I wouldn't, because I was a child and I didn't have the lens that I do now. I would say that that was probably when I grew knowing like a senses of friendships and belonging, and like seeing what worked for me and what didn't. And I think that what's like specific to Beverly is that with Chicago, we know how different neighborhoods have access to different things, but Beverly almost feels like it's its own world. Like I know people in Beverly who don't even have to leave Beverly because Beverly has all that it needs. It has food and grocery stores and businesses and people who own those businesses in the community that gives back into the businesses. And Beverly is genuinely what we would want all of Chicago to look like. But because people in Beverly have privilege and have access to jobs and healthcare and food that doesn't tear your body down and all the things that people need to survive, it is a neighborhood, rather than looking to it as a role model, we look at it as somewhere that we don't want to be because we are used to lifestyles that are less than. But I would say growing up here, and then going back to different environments was definitely displacing. And it itself was very, I don't know how to explain it, but like I know one time my mom went to like a parent teacher conference and the teacher told her like she doesn't need to be here. Like she needs to go to a different school. Like she's just not getting it. And I would always be the kid that like I went to a private Catholic school for some time, and there was like it was a huge thing to get a demerit. I don't know if do you know what that is? Yeah. So it was a huge thing to get a demerit. And no one ever gotten demerits. And I was like one of the first people to. And like people would claim that I was picking on them and bullying them. And I would always be like the sidewalk friend that would like have to like walk in the grass. Like it was a very like illustrating experience that now I think that I've grown up to be someone who's fine with being by myself, and I'm okay with like not feeling accepted, and I'm okay with not always having a place of belonging. But then also too, it wasn't like I was always primarily in Beverly. I was always switching back and forth. And so it would go from where I was like cooking with my grandma in the kitchen and listening to Marvin Gaye, and I would switch over back to code switching and like, you know, not always being able to fit in and belong. But I definitely think that is not an experience that I would trade in. And it's not an experience that I'm ashamed of either, because I think that a lot of times when people go through times of their life where they're in predominantly spaces that they become ashamed of it. But it's not something that I look back on and wish that I had not been in at all.
That's very interesting. So where are you currently?
So now I go back and forth between my different parents, which includes Beverly. I always have. So like I said, it's not like I've always just been like in Beverly and like through the different periods of my life. So I'm either in Brownsville, Beverly, but I go to school in Washington Heights.
Okay. Interesting. So I guess like thinking about you've obviously lived in very different places, including other states, and you talk very powerfully about the relationship you had with Beverly, and your time going to school there. Like, could you speak a bit more, I guess, before we get to Washington Heights, the feelings you had towards your school communities, so in middle school, elementary school, yeah, and what those school communities were like in general.
So before I went to my private Catholic school in Beverly, which was St. John Fisher, I went to Sutherland, which is also in Beverly, but it's a public school. And I would say that that experience was definitely one of the first times where like I would feel empowered in school. I was so little, so I couldn't be like I wasn't able to acknowledge it then. But I think like it was a very careful school community, and because Beverly is a predominantly white area, it was a very diverse school as well. So it wasn't like I was just in a classroom with white kids or Black kids or Latino kids. It was very diverse and it was very inclusive, and everyone was friends with everyone. It was when I went to the private Catholic school that is when I also learned one of my first experiences of community. But I think that the difference is that I realized that that was not my community to be in, or at least that was not a community that was made for me. Um, I remember one of probably the first times that I ever got a sense of like, you are Black and that's the difference between you and them. Um, there was two times. The first one was when Colin Kaepernick took a knee at that football game, and everyone was talking about like burning and destroying their Nikes after that, like not wearing Nike. The second time was um, after the killing of Laquan McDonald and the verdict of, what was his name? Eric Van Dyke? Was it? Yeah, Van Dyke. And their parents, like the school went into a soft lockdown because they were so scared about like Black people coming to Beverly and like protesting and looting and rioting. And everyone's parents picked them up before the school day ended. It was a very like scary experience and everyone was very scared. And it was a very like shallow and dusty and foggy day. My parents did not pick me up. Like there was nothing to be scared of. And it was very like, I don't know how to explain it because I didn't have the words for it, or how to acclaim to that experience at the time, but it was just very differentiating for me. But I would say one of the best things that happened to me at my time at going to school in Beverly was definitely the friendships and the experiences of being a kid that I got to have. Because if it were not for Beverly, I don't think that I would have those experiences. Like here we like ride bikes in the summer. You know, we would like walk to stores and get food and hang out at people's houses and go to basketball games. And like it's a very cultural thing that is specific to Beverly. And like when I think of Beverly, it's like extremely, to me, like it's like a box. Everyone experiences the same things. And it's very rare that one goes outside of that box. And so when you think about the way that people are conditioned to think and the way that we as organizers make movement not accessible to people who don't think like us, it's almost the same as others, like who are of like Beverly, who think the way that they do, but they think the way that they do. And this isn't me extending, well, it is me extending grace, but it's not me making it an excuse. But if you think about it, if there's no one there to break that train of thinking and those harmful ways of believing certain things that are not true, then that enables people to do the things that they do and to think the way that they think and to act the way that they act. And so I think definitely in the final days of the election, I've been thinking about this a lot, that movement is not accessible to people who do not have the same thoughts as we do. And movement does not provide grace to other people outside of movement. And so when we talk about liberation and when we talk about freedom and justice and all of those things, we can't just think that it's us who's going to get it done. And we can't just be ignorant and then claim that other people are ignorant as well. Because it's our ignorance that is creating that division and creating that wall.
Yeah, I think that's so important. Like having that relational and collective, like, I guess formation of liberation is so important. Like, I guess I'm curious, like before we kind of get more into these takeaways you've had from organizing, how did you start organizing while you were still going to school at Beverly, or where did that kind of begin during your educational journey?
So I would say the summer of, it was the pandemic.
Okay.
It was definitely a little bit before the pandemic, but definitely around that range. So I was in 7th grade and I was not still going to school in Beverly. I was in a predominantly Black environment. And I think that I relied on organizing because I was going through such a hard time
Mm,
with my mental health.
okay.
That was like the peak of my depression, and I was self-harming,
Mm,
and it was just really dark for me. But organizing and me getting to use my voice was like something that I would never fail at. And
mm,
it became, I would say, when I was in 8th grade, the winter. So I would say this. My identity and who I was kind of blew up after I gave this speech to city council. Um, at that time, um, I, like I said, was at my peak of depression, but also like it blew up to the fact where like there were a couple of like city council members, like aldermen, who had reached out to me, given me their number.
mm,
Um, that's how I first like started my like relationship with Stacey Davis Gates. And now I look to her like she's my, like we have a mother-daughter relationship.
mm,
Um, but it was Alderman Rosana Rodriguez Sanchez who definitely helped pull me out of my depression. And
mm,
so at the same time that I was experiencing my trauma and my harm, my organizing and my voice was what was able to pull me out of it.
mm,
Uh, After that, it was summer going into 9th grade, and that's when I was staying with my birth mom in Parkway or O Block, whatever people like to call it. Um, and it was less my mental health and more just my surroundings. Because now it wasn't my trauma. I was fine. Now it was my mom's trauma being put on me. It
mm,
was the barrier of having to take care of my 4 little siblings. Um, and it was the physical structure of living in the projects that like I think really beat on me. It's
mm.
like I don't well, I would you mind if I kind of go into that?
Oh no, you're so good.
Okay. But I would always think of it as like this box. And because the tenants are like structured like boxes, and it's almost as if like all of the problems just were like stacked onto each other. And it was more than just like people's mental and the intercommunal violence, like the structural issues within though like those tenants in the projects was just like beyond what you could even imagine. Like
Mm,
there would be like sewage leaking all like it always smelled like there was sewage leaking. Like water leaking from ceilings, mice everywhere, like it just was really traumatic. And it was like a place where like laying your head there is unimaginable. And also too like the conditions of people who live there as well. I don't think that people tend to acknowledge that it's very harsh and traumatic, and people don't live there by choice, and people don't live there because it's cool. um but to did I answer your question?
yeah, no, you definitely did. So I guess could you speak more about that city council speech you mentioned as being like a catalyst to your organizing efforts? Walk me through that experience and the issue you were kind of focused on.
So it was November 2020, and I spoke 2 times. But the last time that I spoke, it was like the final budget vote. And this was big because it was after the uprisings, and they're trying to see if they want to fund or defund the police.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I remember speaking to Mayor Lori Lightfoot. I don't know if I still have, maybe I still have this speech in here, like in my Google Docs or something. But I
Mm-hmm.
remember touching on children in Chicago and the ways that we can imagine and the ways that we need to be thinking outside of boxes that we already exist in. And the way that we have a choice to decide whether we invest in the people or not. And it's not something that's the people's fault at all. Um, those were just a few things that I remember highlighting.
Mm-hmm.
But it blew up on Twitter. And at that time, I was 13 years old. I had just turned 13. And everyone was like, this 13-year-old just shut down Mayor Lori Lightfoot. And it was all on Twitter. And I think that that definitely hooked me in. And from there, I grew a sense of family because these were people that like I now began to lean on. It was harder because it was the pandemic, so it was more of like a virtual online aspect. But now, like, I see these people all the time, and I've grown to like call some of them mom, and it's definitely huge for me too, because some of these people are leaders in movement, which also, if we're talking about movement in the way that these institutions exist, um, and we're talking about reshaping it, I think that my voice has always been like, has been something that has definitely popped up. And because we are family, it's something that
Mm.
like is now like an accountability thing too. Because we can't have these spaces and these conversations without acknowledging that things do need to change and that organizing spaces themselves have become institutions as well.
Mm. That's very interesting. So how did you as a 13-year-old kind of happen to be giving this speech at city council?
So I say in 2020 that I definitely was like into Bernie and AOC, and now I'm a little bit distant from that. But I was had been on a call with the Sunrise Movement talking about them defunding their police in Seattle.
Mm.
And I was like, that's so cool. And I would love to do that, like to speak at a city council meeting here in Chicago. I looked up, I did my research too. Like I was writing, I had looked up what the city has like previously invested into policing, things that we could be investing into. Um, I ended up signing up for the list to speak, and I got
Mm.
the call back from the city clerk. And they told me the rules. I was super scared, but I just like felt the pressure to, like, I felt like something had depended on me then to like
Mm.
and be there.
Yeah, that's so interesting. Like, I'm curious because I think thinking back to that time in my life, I had no idea what the city council was,
Mhm.
um, and like how to even navigate the inner workings of that. And so I think that's pretty amazing that you kind of put yourself into that. You mentioned earlier that through that speech and that experience, you ended up building connections with aldermen, older
Mhm.
people. Um, I guess walk me through those relationships and also the relationships you may have built with other organizers, whether that was virtual or not, or in person.
Yeah. Um, so I would say that after that, and after just me being in organizing spaces for a minute, that my relationships with people can look like two ways. It could be number one, an actual like family type thing. I don't know what organizers you've talked to, but before me, it's okay. Well, let me explain. There seems to be a pattern of putting young organizers on pedestals in Chicago. So before me, you had your Jalen and Alicia. I don't know if you know of them. Do you know of them?
Mhm. Yeah.
Yeah. So before me, you had your Jalen and Alicia, and because they were
If
like,
you could also explain a bit more about them too, since we're,
yeah. So Jalen and Alicia, Jalen doesn't even call themselves an organizer because of their traumatic experiences with Chicago organizing
Mhm.
spaces. But I mean, have done some of the most dopest work. They were both a part of Good Kids Mad City, but ended up leaving because their presence was abused and taken advantage of and not given credit for.
Mm.
But like Alicia during the pandemic started grocery drives
Mm.
by themselves, started grocery drives in different communities, I think on the west side. Um, they drafted most of Good Kids Bad City's peace book that no one talks about, and
Mm.
that GKMC doesn't really even give them credit for because they're not in the group anymore.
Mm.
Um, but like they at some point carried Youth Chicago organizing. Um, I think there's been like other campaigns and things that have like, been centered, like No Cop Academy, which was really big. But the issue now is that that torch that people have had from that light being shined on them hasn't been passed down.
Mm.
And people haven't allowed young people now
Mm.
to shape and structure the way that organizing looks. And so that's an issue when you have your Good Kids Mad City. And like Jalen and Alicia have like kind of went out of the picture because they got tired of all of that pressure and etc. But like we talk every day. They're my big siblings. And so we talk all the time about organizing structures. I'm sorry, there's like snot in my nose, but we talk all the time. Like we were just talking yesterday, and it's really a sibling relationship that I have with them. It's no phony stuff. And they always keep it real. And sometimes, like before I even go to events, I'll ask them like, "Yo, should I go to this or not?" Because they understand the struggle between like you're a young person and a stipend looks really good when you're not employed, but also this organizing space is abusive. So it goes a little bit like that. I would also say too that there's organizations like Good Kids Med City who not necessarily are made of young people who like are in high school or who are genuinely young people, but GKMC is what most organizers think of when they think of young people. So it's this thing in organizing spaces in Chicago where organizing is not sustainable at all. And so we basically depend on those who we already have instead of cultivating that sense of leadership and skill within other young people. And so then that creates the like process and concepts that puts people like me on pedestals. And so like I was saying, it looks like two of one ways, or one of two ways. Either people having that relationship because they are putting you on a pedestal, and so it's more of a it's so cool that I'm even talking to you relationship, or it's a genuine thing that like I said, like my mother-daughter relationships are probably one of the realest. I think one of my realest relationships that I have with anyone is Stacey Davis Gates, who is the president of the teachers union. But also too, we have such a genuine like family relationship that when people come for her and attack her on Twitter, like I do not play that. One thing about it is that you can talk about me, because if you talk about me, like you look like you look bogus. You're talking about a 15-year-old. I recently got into it with Jamal Green, who ran for mayor, because he was attacking me on Twitter and saying that I was a plant of the teachers union. And I said what I said, and that also went viral. But the minute that he started talking about Stacey Davis Gates, I shut that down completely, because obviously when you're an adult, it's easy to be like, don't pay those people any mind. But when you see it as people coming for your family, that's a whole entire different ball game. And so I think that those two contrasting relationships are definitely defining when it comes to me, because I don't like being put on a pedestal. I like being held accountable. I like when people slow me down and check me and check where I'm at. I appreciate when people can relate to me. I was at the Bernie Sanders rally for Brandon Johnson, and I had all access, because like I came in and I was in Brandon Johnson's holding room, which was right next to Bernie Sanders. It was me, Stacey, Brandon, and then some of like Brandon's spokespeople. And someone was like texting me later and was like, "Oh, I saw you, but I was too scared to say hi." And so when we have these people who are in positions of power or like even put on a pedestal, it creates a division and a sense of hierarchy between people and those who like aren't like a part of the hierarchy. And I don't like it at all. And I don't like how it's like we're the face, or I'm the face of youth organizing right now. I don't believe that. I believe that yes, there are people who are leaders and there are people who lead, and that's fine. And that's fine that I'm one of those people. However, if we're not cultivating that passion and that drive within other people, then it's really not a movement that we're making. And it's really not connections and spaces that we're creating. We're just enabling systems and concepts that have already existed for many years. Yeah.
That's so important, and I feel like very necessary too when it comes to building abolitionist movements.
Mhm.
I'm curious about the organizations that kind of exist within with Chicago Youth Organizing, and how oftentimes the entry point that a lot of youth have into organizing is by kind of latching to an organization slash
Mhm.
associating with an organization.
Yeah.
So I'm curious if you could speak to that.
I've been wanting to speak to this for a very long time. Um, so it is very often for organizations to groom young people. And I'll say that very clearly and very proudly, because people who it's typical that adults run these organizations and they have young people come a part of them, as if it's like a mission or something, because they need young people to keep that organization running. And so it's easy for adults in those spaces. Alexa, pause. Sorry, I didn't realize that was running this whole time. But it's easy for people in those organizations to act as if those children are their property and are like a part of their cause and make who they are like what they are. And so it's easy to have some sense of obligation and some sense of like ownership when it comes to organizations. I was once in well, then also too, the thing is that it's easy as a young person to fall into that when you hear and see that these organizations are doing all these kinds of work.
Mm,
Um, but when you actually look into like what those orgs are made up of and what goes on behind the scenes, it's absurd.
mm,
Um, so when I first got into organizing, was totally interested in joining Asada's Daughters. The way that you join an organization though is super weird because you
mm,
often have the people like it's like a recruitment kind of thing. And so it's almost as if like people are talking to you and holding conversations as if you don't know what's going on, or if you
mm,
are only like at capacity to speak to a certain degree, or you can't like speak up against the way that something is structured.
mm,
So this was like back when, like after my city council's speech and all of that. So it was like 2020, going into 2021. And then I realized that I wasn't really interested in that process anymore. Then I did a fellowship with Chicago Freedom School. And
mm,
this is what definitely I think opened up my eyes a ton, because
mm,
Chicago Freedom School was known during the uprisings to had harbor young protesters and fight off police and do these amazing things. Um, and that was the same summer that I was in Parkway,
okay.
and it was it was really weird.
Mm,
Um, I had a friend who was assaulted by another young person. However, it was like my friend was younger than this young person though. So they were 18. My friend was 17 or 16, had just turned 17. And the way the Chicago Freedom School dealt with it was um that we don't treat anyone as if they're disposable, right? But
mm,
what does disposability mean when someone is in the same space as someone like as the person who's assaulted them?
mm,
And so that was something that like was definitely reshaping for me. But then later, um, in the school year, so this was 2022 in January when I staged like the walkout. Have you heard of it?
mm,
Okay, so um this was at the same time that the teachers union had went on a labor, not a labor strike, but a labor stoppage.
yeah,
Yeah. And students, I led I think it was maybe I no, it was the largest student walkout since Dr. King in 1963. But like I had started this organization called Chirads.
okay.
And some of the people who were with me in that group were also from Chicago Freedom School.
Mm,
Um, but Chicago Freedom School had this like obligation to be there and to feel like because I was a part of it and other young people are a part of it that they had to be there and that they were almost like fostering into this organization.
Mm,
I ended up leaving Chirads because again, another like situation where an older young person was targeting me and being misogynistic and like called me a soft dictator, called me out my name, and was like, I'm not going to be a part of this because I'm not like everyone's deeming this as like the Catlyn show.
mm,
Um, eventually, their older siblings had gotten involved, and like when we talk about or not, like so their older sibling was like a employee for CFS, and then their mom works for BLM Chicago. I don't know if you've heard about like what has happened with BLM Chicago, but
mm,
they're known for like money laundering.
mm,
And so this person who was like an offspring of all of that, um, had their older sibling tell one of my friends, like threaten them basically,
mm,
and was like, I draw blood about my blood over how Shiraz was being run. So I left the organization, and after that, that's when my relationship with Jalen and Alicia grew stronger because they had already known the rodeo with Chicago Freedom School. Even with Asada's daughters, they knew the rodeo, but I didn't at the time. So all of the
mm,
knowledge that I have about everything comes from Jalen and Alicia,
mm,
and just my experiences of not like rolling with how the things go, basically.
yeah.
And so I say all of that to say that it's very easy to fall into patterns. It's very easy to become a part of something because it feels good.
Mm,
However, there's much more to making change that like existing spaces give.
mm,
Um because they don't give much, and many times the reasons why they need young people is because they are nonprofit organizations who
mm,
need to spend their money somehow some way.
mm,
I currently am doing a fellowship with the organization called the Long Walk Home, and
mm,
I've been having issues with them because it's almost as if like we don't like they just like take us places that's really cool,
mm,
and they take pictures and then they get us Ubers home, but then that's it. And I've been trying to explain that if I'm being a part of something, I want to be a part of that something because I feel like I'm actually doing something for my community.
mm,
But us just holding spaces and traveling um, isn't doing anything but creating a gate between people and community and people like us.
yeah.
And we can talk about Black girlhood and we can talk about liberation and all of these different things, but who is it serving if we're only talking amongst ourselves? And they have money, they have resources, but it's not being distributed
Yeah.
amongst the young people in the group nor people in community.
Mm,
And I had spoke at I was a part of the mayoral forum, the youth-led mayor forum,
mm,
um, that Good Kids in That City had led. And the Long Walk Home, GKMC basically wanted young people there to fill up the room, so they
mm,
had asked a Long Walk Home to be a part of it. A Long Walk Home eventually asked me to be there for them, and
mm,
I explained to them then that I said no, and I said no because there's not a single organization that has cultivated the person that I am, and I
mm,
don't organize any under any organization.
mm,
And I'm my own person. So whatever space I'm in, that's because I've been asked to do it under my own circumstance.
mm,
And they like I definitely set the tone, but it's like people don't know how to respect boundaries when it comes to young people's organizing.
mm,
Um, Last week, Chicago Votes had like this get out the vote rally for young people along with GKMC. They asked me to be there and they asked me to speak. And there was multiple controversies that I had with them. Number one was that it was during a school day
mm,
and it was supposed to be a field trip. However, when you are asking like my school is predominantly Black, and these are people who come from the Roseland and Washington Heights communities.
Mm,
And so my peers are not as educated as other young people would be when it comes to voting and when it comes to organizing. And
mm,
so it has been me who's been trying to lead those efforts within my school community, and it's been a struggle within itself. So
mm,
not only was Chicago Votes asking me to show up, but they're asking me to organize the kids and the teachers to be there as well. And
mm,
that was a lot. The second thing was that we didn't have school that Wednesday. So it would have been more accessible to young people who may not like been able to vote, but wanted to be there and support, like me, who they even asked to speak, but I couldn't even go because I wasn't 18. But they
mm,
didn't even acknowledge that. And then the other thing too was, am I being compensated for my work?
mm,
Which is something that I've struggled to ask, but I've had organizers like Jalen and Alicia who have helped me build the confidence to ask questions like that. And when I ask them, um, well, to give context so that I don't sound ungrateful,
mm,
typically organizations offer like 150, 200, $300. Um, and that's fine. And like when you're unemployed, that's good. Like I don't typically ask for money, but you're asking me to do all of this, and they offered me $50.
mm,
And Chicago Votes had they just got a new office building downtown. Um and like they have the money, and it was just super weird to me that that was the situation of it all. But it's so, if I'm someone who's aware of all of those things, imagine young people who are not, you
mm.
know?
Yeah, that's very interesting. And I feel like you're illuminating a lot about the dynamics that exist within organizing communities that are often like not talked about or looked at whenever these movements are being documented. So I think that's important.
Mhm.
Um, I do want to note, like you mentioned, um, efforts within your school, and we didn't get to talk about Washington Heights a lot.
Mhm.
So if we could, I guess if you could tell me a bit about what efforts you may have been involved in within your school, what those dynamics were also like, and how related to the
Mhm.
out of school organizing you're kind of telling me a lot about.
Yeah. So at my school, I'm only a sophomore. So
Mhm,
last year, um, I would say before the walkout and before my name was all over the place again, um, I definitely set the tone because that was when we were talking about COVID safety and needing different measurements within the school. And so at first I didn't have a great relationship with students or teachers and administrators in my building. I think that after the walkout, which we had let me give more context about the walkout.
mm,
It was around having more COVID safe and just overall measurements in schools that students need in order to be able to not just survive but live. So
mm,
that looked like us even talking about making, it was a whole list of things. I can't even think of it right now. Um, but just making learning about nourishing and keeping kids safe and having loving school communities, because that is what fosters a good community,
mm,
and creates a pathway to like communities that can excel.
mm,
And so the day of the walkout, we had about like 70 kids who walked out with me.
mm,
And that's a lot for my school that harbored 400 kids, but I would say that day maybe only like 125 kids came to school.
mm,
So it was a lot, but I think even before that, like teachers would let me lesson plan within classrooms and give lessons.
interesting.
Some of it was like abolition 101. It was like I like literally in my seminar class, my teacher would let me talk about what organizing spaces looked like and what are some efforts that we could do in our own school community,
Mm,
like having food pantries or community garden. Um, or like creating our, now we've been talking more about making our school like home. And
mm,
so now I have much better relationships with the adults in my building. So much so that like my principal, he's gotten some funding. And so a good third of that funding, he was like, Kate, I'm gonna leave it up to you all. He was talking to our student voice committee. And so like now we're deciding like we want a peace room and we want things in the lunchroom. We're gonna get a community garden. So just things that that some schools have and they don't even like view it as something to be grateful for. Um, but I would definitely say that my school community right now is something that keeps me going and something that I envision working and working on and caring for a very long time.
Yeah, that's awesome. And it's very interesting too to hear the fact that like you're able to have collaboration with your administration and teachers in a way that was fruitful. Do you feel like that is a accurate representation of most of your interactions with school administration and like teachers throughout your kind of high school organizing work?
Yeah, I would say that it's so much so that I'm able to see, like when people talk about how teachers are and how adults are, like I almost understand the full experience of what it is to be a teacher in Chicago public schools and all of the loopholes that come along with it, and all the struggles and hardships. And I have very like I depend on them even outside of school too. It's harder because we're in Chicago public schools and our communications are limited, but those are my support people. And to even see the way that the dynamics of my relationships with them have
Mm,
changed as well. I think that's something that I've realized is that we are all that we have,
mm,
and none of us are competing with each other. And
mm.
we're all, quite frankly, experiencing the same things. And it takes all of us to get the job done.
Yeah, yeah, that's beautiful. How do you think your school community dealt with cops out CPS and a lot of the things that came up about SROs, especially going into the work with the city budget, defunding CPD, and all of that?
hmm so I think that this is what I mean when I say that movement is out of touch with community.
Mm,
Because those were concerns like cops out of CPS and having a police officer in our school building were concerns that I would have brought up this last year,
mm,
and last school year, about how cops don't keep us safe and metal detectors don't keep us safe. And this year, now I understand why people believe that we need cops in schools. And now I understand why people believe that we need metal detectors.
mm,
And typically it's because there's fear mongering around young Black people,
mm,
but also because those are the things that typically keep us safe right now. When we don't have any other way, like the city functions so that we only rely on policing and conditioning people to a certain degree, to where we don't have other resources. We don't have social workers, um, to come to people who are having mental health issues. We don't have nurses in our schools when people are having physical, like, healthcare issues. And we don't have outlets and peacekeepers and counselors and everything that like the supports that people genuinely need
mm,
to prevent crime in the first place.
yeah,
And so when we condition people to only rely on police, not just emotionally and psychologically, but structurally, like, yeah, people are gonna believe that we need cops in our schools.
yeah,
Um, and so it's become a thing where like even like I speak to our SRO. That's the person who's in our community. And it's not even a point of like, oh, we need police and we need policing, but it is a point of like we can't keep isolating the two different sides,
mm,
and isolating each other does not work at all. And
mm,
I there's a point where like I would not speak to police. There's a point where I wholeheartedly did not believe that we needed policing and that policing does not work, and policing does not work, and that is completely true. However, right now in this moment, when we don't have any other systems or structures to rely on, that's what people are going to rely on. And
mm,
when we are spoon fed the fact that young people are these scary figures who like, continuously engage in violence. Like I know people who engage in intercommunal violence, and they are some of the biggest sweethearts that I ever like really know. Um, but to hear different perspectives and things painted for them, it's really hard. Because these are people who I hang out with and who I care for. Um, but then also to see like the reason why people genuinely believe that. And so to answer your question, I think that my school dealt it the way that would deal with it, the way that any school who's not really in touch with movement would. But I would also say that movement is not always right. And not always right as in like, yes, the statistics are right, but the way that we approach things has to be different if we genuinely want to see change.
Mm. Yeah, I think that's interesting. I'm thinking back to some of my other interviewees and kind of the experiences they had after it was determined that like the local school councils would kind of vote and figure out if SROs should stay in whatever school the LSC is serving. And a lot of kind of the struggle that organizers who were in Cops Out CPS movement had with fighting for mental health resources and asking for increased number of counselors and social workers while also demanding that SROs kind of leave the schools, and
Mhm.
the movement kind of having to pigeonhole into like remove SROs first, but without it being necessarily like being able to have like equal I guess like advocacy for both increased mental health resources and also removal of police and tying that to defund CPD. So I think it's interesting the points you're bringing up. Um, a bit of a tangent. You talked about the fruitful relationships you've had with teachers and
Mhm.
administrators, and earlier you mentioned Stacey Davis Gates and your relationship with her. So I'm
Mhm.
curious if you can like walk us through how that kind of happened, and a bit more of that relationship and also your relationship with the Chicago Teachers Union in general.
So my relationship with Stacey Davis Gates,
Yeah.
um, I would say that it branched off um last school year. She was definitely so before Stacey was Alderman
Mm,
Rodriguez Sanchez.
okay.
And that was probably one of the most radiant, like she's just one of the most radiant and vibrant people that I know.
Mm,
And very like joyful and grounding, and was a great support person. And then after her came Stacey.
mm,
And Stacey was kind of the same, but Stacey was different because she's a Black woman.
mm,
And she said, like, she just, I see so much of myself within her, but because she's an adult, um, it's different for her because she has to conform, and she is an ode to an institution.
mm,
Um, and so I think that, yeah, it started off as me just leaning on her shoulder a bit. And then it later it just over time has become something that's just very normal for me.
mm,
Like usually we would just like call almost every day,
mm,
or text almost every day. There's been like time periods like election season, because it was election season for her back in June.
mm,
Um, but like election season is hard. I think the height of our relationship though was when CTU had their labor stoppage,
mm,
and we were experiencing the same thing because as she was at the bargaining table, I was on meetings with young people trying to organize young people
mm,
around COVID safety issues.
mm,
And so we were experiencing the same exact things. We would ground each other, and we have like this thing, like we hold each other's hands. And I think it's a very like, I think what's very unique about my relationships to people in movement is that it's chosen family.
mm,
Um, so in the sense that like it's not even a relationship where she puts me on a pedestal or I put her on a pedestal. It's like, oh my God, Stacey Davis Gates. Not at all. It's almost as if like when I see her in public and like people are asking to take pictures of her, and like things like that, it's almost like so weird to me.
Mm,
Um, like this is someone who I talk to every day, and not even a sense of like needing support or anything. It's just like that's mama. And
mm,
it's very weird to me that like people view her as like this superhero. But I
mm,
would understand why it's easy to view someone as a superhero as well. Um, but like even her and I have had those conversations of like it's very easy for people for us to accept the fact that people like admire us.
mm,
Um, but it's also very easy for us to accept people who don't and
mm,
who will like tear us down. And it just I don't know, it's been a very natural thing for me. Like so much so that like I can't even like describe how it is
mm,
because it is so natural. But also too, because I do respect her privacy and our relationship isn't something that like I typically put or like we typically put in the public eye
mm,
because I am a student leader
mm,
and she is the president of the teachers union. And
mm,
so though that dynamic to people is very easy to twist.
mm,
And I mean, even with Jamal Green, like what he said was like crossed the line and was a boundary for me
mm,
because like my relationship with someone that is very normal and I care for a lot and you took advantage of that. And so it's been an eye opener as to who I like let in on my,
mm.
personal relationships.
Yeah, I think that's very important and also beautiful that you cultivated those kinds of relationships. And earlier too, your discussion of like Jalen and Alicia as being
Mhm.
like almost sibling figures for you, and
Yeah.
strong relationships you've kind of built from the organizing that you got involved with. I'm
Mhm.
curious what relationship building looks like for you with the other youth that you were actively organizing with around COVID safety, what those meetings were like, what the walkout was like.
So some of the youth that I met through Chicago Freedom School, we had grown friendships
Okay.
um, over time. And so when I was thinking about starting the organization, they were one of the first people who I went to ask.
Mm,
Um, the relationship dynamics are very weird because it almost creates, like, because of those senses of hierarchy,
mm,
it has created division within my relationships to people.
mm,
Um, But I would say that during the time, they were very flourishing spaces. And when I say that, it was wholeheartedly young people, like the oldest people that we had. So we had like our adult mentors,
mm,
which was like Jalen, Alicia,
mm,
and some older organizers who knew the game. But those were like the people in our spaces who we deemed as adult, and even them, like they weren't adults yet.
mm.
Um, so
Was it
that's how
CFS?
I'm sorry.
It's in CFS
Um,
or in Shire?
Chirats.
Okay, okay.
Yeah. Um, and so it was very like liberating for me and very eye-opening too to see how it is that I want to engage with other young people. And I think it's also something that like I've had to be um aware of because it has also shown me very envious energy as well.
Mm,
And like everyone's not always on your team.
mm,
And I think that I've acknowledged that as I've gotten a little bit older as well. Um, but for the most part, in the moment, it was definitely fruitful and vibrant. I mean, it would be like, I think at one point we had like maybe 200 young people who had signed up to be in the org. And so at that point, we had to figure out how were we going to structure this thing.
mm.
Um, and yeah.
That's very interesting. And like, I guess like what were those conversations around structuring, especially it being like a space that was a bit distinct from other organizations that a lot of people think too, that do have like adults involved in them. versus like, yeah, you guys had older people, they weren't necessarily adults, right? So I'm curious, like, if you could speak more about those conversations, and then also like the actual direct action work you guys did and like what that looked like, especially during a pandemic.
Um, so the organization didn't last for long.
Mm,
And so I think that one of my biggest regrets is that we took a window for direct action, a window of opportunity while the labor stoppage and
mm,
the momentum was there. I think something that I always ask myself after protests is what happens next?
mm,
And what are we giving to community now?
mm,
And that was my main push around the conversations after the walkout. It
mm,
was, what are we doing for community? How do we plug in and plug out into different schools? And how do we make sure that we are creating spaces of not necessarily where we're talking at people, and not necessarily where there's one person over the other,
mm,
but we're still respecting the people who built this coalition. We're still respecting the people who have come and who have struggled. And we're allowing new people and new ideas in.
mm,
And more so creating a sense of respect.
mm,
And I think that people had an issue with that. People definitely had an issue with respecting someone who was younger than them. And it was there was a time where we could all agree on the different structures, which my idea was that we had the core body. So I definitely was inspired by CTU and the way that they organized when it came to the Chirads group.
mm,
Because CTU has their core, they have their House of Delegates, and then they obviously have their like executive officers. And so we had our core, which was people who helped organize the walkout, had been there before the walkout,
mm,
and genuinely shaped and structured the group as a whole. And then we had the folks who we were welcoming in. But it was really, really hard because as the space was evolving, we were defining what the space was being made of.
mm,
Um, but different people had different ideas, and they were so used to these adult oriented spaces that
mm,
that kind of came in and took too much leeway.
mm,
And it's Jalen and Alicia say this all the time, but that group um ended up being nothing without me, and that kind of sucked, which shows that when you have a group that depends on one person too much, then that's an issue. But
mm,
also it may not be that one person that like is allowing space for that, but
mm,
it also may be like it might also be the failures of other people as well. And
mm,
those other people, if they're not willing to be held accountable, then that's another issue.
mm,
um so that was definitely an eye-opening experience for me.
mm,
And because of that, I've been struggling to find more spaces where young people can organize. And I've been struggling with creating and establishing that space because I just don't want to make the same mistakes over.
mm. That makes so much sense. When you say that the structure was kind of something that was evolving as more people came in, you said like that was helping us understand like what this place was becoming. I'm
Mhm.
curious if it was the same thing with like the explicit mission and goal of the organization. Like, what would you say was the mission starting out, and did that change over time as the organization structure was shifting?
Definitely. Let me pull it up because I remember it was posted
Mm,
on Instagram. It was like basically myself and another organizer drafted out kind of an introduction letter to the org, if that makes
mhm,
sense.
mhm,
Um, I can read it, a little bit of it.
mm,
Um, let me see. It's still in here. Yeah. So it was very forthcoming, and it highlighted who exactly we represent and who we are a reflection of.
mm,
So it said to it was a letter of declaration from newly formed Chicago Public Schools Radical Youth Alliance.
Mm.
to Mayor Lori Lightfoot, Chicago Department of Public Health Commissioner Dr. Arwadi, and CPS Executive Pedro Martinez. We, the young people of Chicago Public Schools, have conjoined an alliance across a multitude of high schools and neighborhoods throughout the city and the north, south, east, and west sides. As queer, Black, and brown youth, we officially established an organization steered, executed, executed, and operated by youth to respond to the outstanding needs of our communities and to advocate to the needs and calls of our city's young people and community members. We stand on the grounds of supporting our city's educators, parents, and community members, but most of all, ourselves and peers. We believe in the reimagination of our education to make sure that it is not just the condition of what learning should look like in the eyes of American capitalists. Our education and process of educating young people should be amongst effectiveness, radiating, loving, caring, and liberating, not just the binary of what we are conditioned to believe. And then there's just a little list of demands that was relevant in the moment when it came to COVID. But that was definitely like the full and through and through vision of what the org looks like, and for a while how it was run. I think even to like spaces, we began to like explain that, like, when orgs have their not rules, but their what do you call it?
Like a code of conduct?
Yeah, basically. And it didn't necessarily look like how other orgs had it. It was, in this space, Black young people, and specifically Black femme young people, come first. In this space, we respect each other's identities. In this space, we speak up, we stand up and stand back. In this space, like things that was actually liberating. And I think that at some point, some folks didn't like that because it was very demeaning when it came to existing structures that had already existed, where certain people's identities were not acknowledged and shaped. I think the first rule that I had came up with surrounding Black bodies, Black minds, Black souls, and specifically Black femme bodies, minds, and souls came from how I was treated and how other folks were treated at Chicago Freedom School. But it definitely was redefining how specific spaces looked like.
Yeah, that's very important. What would you say are like the biggest things that kind of came out of that space before it kind of fell apart? Whether that's just like takeaways or tangible, like, yeah.
I think for the first time ever, people saw the power of young people in the city of Chicago. I think that was probably one of the best takeaways that I could have. Secondly, I would say that it was not accessible to young people who are deemed as not worthy of organizing. I think oftentimes we don't allow young people who are deemed as troublemakers into spaces. And that's a huge issue when we talk about cultivating and wanting to envision better pathways for those young people. I think my other takeaway would be that we were not tangible to the needs of community. So that org ended up raising a lot of money. I don't know how much because I was not in charge of finance, but raised a lot of money. And when I left, and I left after, it's really hard because I don't want to sound cocky, but a lot of the reasons why people were supporting Shy Rides is because they knew that my name was behind it. So to leave this org where I wanted that money to be used for food pantries at certain schools. I wanted it to be so that we could get young people from different schools to come in and organize and we could compensate them. I don't know where that money went.
Mm,
I'm sure it was spent, but like no one organized after that. They didn't do anything to have needed to use the money after that.
mm,
So it's a shame that like it kind of just went down the drain.
mm,
Um, and that people took advantage of those funds because people like money is definitely a huge thing when it comes to organizing, and it's
mm,
essential that we're compensating young people. Um, but yeah, so it was that, and I think the other thing would be is I definitely shifted my way of thinking, and I definitely after the walkout, I kind of disappeared from organizing spaces for a hot minute. I
mm,
would be at like little events that I would speak at, but I wasn't doing the organizing that I was doing in that year before.
mm,
And I definitely got a sense of action planning that I would not want to do anymore because it just protests just don't make any sense anymore.
mm,
We take people out of our communities to go downtown to protest in a space where the city does not want us, where they
mm,
have structurally made it so we are over policed in those spaces. And then we're yelling at institutions who do not care how they treat us
mm,
instead of us doing the on the groundwork in our communities and trying to make sure that our communities are aware of the conditions first. So then we have the people and the manpower to actually get things done.
mm. I think that's so important. Um, I think that throughout you've kind of already touched on a lot of the like takeaways you've had and reflection you've done after your organizing.
Mm.
But I guess I'm curious when asked about your politics and commitment and the kind of learning you've done as a result of organizing, like how do you think that all of this work right now is currently shaping like what you want to do in the future
Mm.
and the politics you employ? Like you mentioned earlier, being involved with election stuff, like so feel free to talk about any of that.
Um, so I think that it's definitely created a boundary for me and how I interact with folks.
Mm,
Um, I there's so I'm gonna be completely honest. There's some things that I do that like I'll show up because I know that I'm the person with the voice to do it.
mm,
Because I genuinely want to be there, or because I like the politics of the people there. For instance, yesterday I was at a press conference at the Rainbow Push Coalition,
mm,
and I've had some issues with the Reverend Jesse Jackson and how much space he takes up in movement,
mm,
and even the old people in movement who refuse to pass on the torch. However, I showed up because I felt like I'm depended on,
mm,
and because sometimes it just feels good to have my voice in the air,
mm,
honestly. Um, but I would also say that the way that I view it um, is hard because at the same time that the older that we get, where our sense of conformity grows, but
mm,
also too like I just want to give back, and I want to give back in the best ways that I know how, and I want to not wait to grow up to do that.
mm,
Um, and I think that Chicago is in a sanctuary right now where we need to be hands on, and that's outside of the election, right? And it sucks that there's people who even believe that in order for us to get anything done, that we have to elect somebody into office to get it done. And
mm,
that's not how it works at all. I love Brandon Johnson to death, but that's because just like Stacey, he's a figure who in my life I care about. I'm
mm,
not running around for him because I think that electoralism is the best. I'm running around for him because I know that he's the person that we need, but
mm,
also because I understand that Paul Vallis is a very destructive force who we cannot let get our hands on,
yeah.
get his hands on our city. Um, but I think that it wouldn't be fair for myself to define how my future looks, because there's so many things that I want to do. Um, I just want to feed people, and I
Mm,
just want people to be liberated, and I want us to redefine what revolution and what evolution of our spaces look like.
mm,
Because I think for me, organizing doesn't look like an event where we're all just speaking to the same 5 people, the same 100 people who we always speak to. To
Yeah.
me, organizing looks like getting young people who engage in intercommunal violence all in one room, and we're sitting down, we're having a meal, and we're conversating about ways to intervene with their ways.
Yeah.
That's what organizing, like, organizing to me looks like little, like, Black kids just dancing. It looks like Black kids walking around their neighborhood and riding their bikes around their neighborhood. It looks like reclaiming the spaces that we've been displaced from. So it looks like Black kids in Hyde Park. And it looks like Black people being uncomfortable in those spaces as well.
Mm.
Those are the things that makes me feel liberated in it. And those are the things that I think that brings joy. And I
Mm.
think that we need to stop thinking that organizing looks like one way or the other.
Mm. I think that's so incredible. Like you push, you're very set on like one, naming the limitations of movement and the inaccessibility of movement. And I think that's so necessary and rarely found. But also just like challenging what we think organizing is. It's not always protest.
Mhm.
And there's also limitations to that. So I think that's very important. You've kind of already touched on this, but two questions that are interrelated. How is this organizing and how is this organizing currently changing how you relate to your neighborhood? So you could talk about Beverly or Parkway and the project. Um, or two, how has it changed your relationship to formal schooling, like the system, education system?
Um, I think it's changed my specific relationship to Beverly because Beverly's not like I'm rarely outside when I'm here.
Mm.
Uh, because it has shifted my comfortability levels.
Mm.
To the point where like I like spending my time more in Bronzeville.
Mm.
Which if I'm out in a neighborhood, it's either Bronzeville or Hyde Park.
Mm.
But not even just to this neighborhood. I think even like downtown. Like I don't like being downtown
Mm.
anymore. Because it's not a place where I'm welcome, you know? Um, and even like my relationship to like North Side neighborhoods, like I don't like being up there because they have access to things that the South Side
Mm.
historically and structurally doesn't.
Mhm.
And I would say my relationship to schooling, um, as far as like the typical things that schools believe, or even that they're forced to believe, like for instance, in order to maintain good grades, in order to be a good kid, you have to be in class, and that is just not true.
Mhm.
Um, I think my school has a very particular experience, and we call it the Julian syndrome
Mm.
because it just doesn't feel like school,
Yeah.
and it genuinely feels like we're just there to be babysat,
Mm.
and the days kind of just loop in with each other,
Mm.
and it's a huge struggle, and I'm trying to find ways to break that like
Mm.
feeling.
Mm.
But it doesn't break until we fix the way that our school is structured, in
Mm.
which is what I'm partnering with my principal to do. So,
Mm.
um, but even like with attendance, like I'm not always in all of my classes. However, I am number one in my class and I have like a 4.2 GPA. And
Mm.
so like me even redefining the way that schooling is with my own beliefs,
Mm.
um, is very special to me.
Yeah, I think that's interesting too. And something that keeps coming up with a lot of youth who are involved in organizing tend to be students who are academically like doing better than their counterparts at schools.
Mhm.
And to your point earlier, um, many youth organizers feeling that students who are labeled troublemakers or trouble or kind of labeled the bad kids um
Mhm.
are not funneled into movement spaces, which is interesting too when a lot of the policies are mostly impacting them. So I think that's interesting. If you
Mhm.
want to speak more to that.
Um, I think, well, I will say to one side of the point, I think that students who are in organizing spaces have more knowledge of the world that we exist in.
Mm.
Um, and that's great. However, I think that we're often used as like an example, and that definitely sucks.
Mm-hmm.
And it sucks not for us, but it sucks for other kids who don't get the opportunity to have light shined on them.
Right.
And so it's important that we're shining light on others as well. And I think that it's it's not something that I enjoy. I
Mm.
don't enjoy um when teachers like me, but they don't like the next because they're deemed as like a behavior, like they have behavioral issues or something. Like I don't enjoy that. I am known like to argue, like not argue, but I'm known to like build relationships with those kids in my
Mhm.
school. So it's not really a cultural divide between me and them.
Mm.
Like for instance, if I'm in the hallway and someone who's deemed as a troublemaker is in the hallway, the security guard will yell at them and not me. And I'll be like, I'm in the hallway too. And
Mm.
they'll be like, well, you no 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 no. And I was like, if it applies to them, then it applies to me.
Mm.
Like it's not, and then too, like you can't just assume that people are bad people, because when you treat people like that, then that's how they're gonna act, you know?
Yeah, that's very true. So I guess as we come to an end, um, I have I guess like looking back at the work that you've been doing, you're still in high school.
Mhm.
What are you most proud of and what are you most hopeful for?
Um, I'm most proud of the relationships that I've built,
Mm.
not just with the like people who are deemed as leaders in organizing spaces,
Mm.
but with the people in my community,
Mm.
um, with the old and the young, and with the black and the white. I think that's definitely something that I can look back and be proud of and embrace.
Mm.
Because when we don't build relationships, or we build our relationships with the wrong foundations,
Yeah.
that causes damage to the work that we want to do.
Mm.
And I think that's something that I'm most hopeful for
Mm.
is mm, creating spaces where people get to cultivate who they are and not be defined by other people or labels,
Mm.
and creating spaces that are accessible to everyone, and spaces where everyone can learn and everyone can build off one another,
Mm.
and creating spaces that doesn't limit us based on our place in humanity.
Yeah, I think that's beautiful. So, as the last question, like, what would you like to say to current or future Chicago youth, like that are mobilizing in their communities with or without, allegiance to different organizations, and are focused on like racial justice and education equity work?
I would say don't let anyone put a limit or capacity on how much space you take up,
Mm.
and don't let anyone don't allow anyone to define who you are. And it's okay to make mistakes and learn and
Mhm.
grow and evolve. And it's okay to make mistakes and be stuck.
Mm.
And it's okay to not know how to navigate certain spaces, and that's totally fine. But I think that oftentimes, because we're supposed to just sit and listen, and we're supposed to just like be taught, I
Mm.
think that it's important that we advocate that, number one, these people who come before us, or even if there's a me and there's a younger person who's younger than me who has the same drive, the same passion,
Mm.
is let older people know to pass on the torch.
Mm.
Um, and if they're not passing on the torch, then they better be teaching you and educating you on how to cultivate your own
Mm.
voice, have your own ideations and your own thoughts and your own beliefs and dreams.
Yeah.
Um, and I would also say that to not allow other people to give you books and thoughts and ideas on who you are and who your peers are, but rather demand people to give you the pencils and the pens and the tools to illustrate the world that you want to live in and who you are, and what you want the world that you exist in to be.
Mm,
Because I think that adults and older people tend to allow systems to get into their head,
mm,
and that builds a sense of conformity. And so then they believe that we have to adapt in this world that they have been enabled in, and that they have enabled, but that is not for us to do. And we can do whatever we decide to do.
yeah, that's beautiful. Thank you so much, Caitlin. I know I've taken a lot of your time. Is there anything that we didn't talk about that you'd like to add?
No.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. I'm gonna end the recording now. Um, Wait, actually, there is a set of like demographic questions that I'm supposed to ask for research purposes. You do not have to answer a question if you don't want to, for whatever reason. So I'll just kind of go through them, and I'll make sure that this part of the recording is cut out. So this will not be part of the archive at all. This is just for knowing, I guess, the pool of people who I end up talking with. What racial and or ethnic identities would you identify with?
African American or Black.
What is your gender identity?
Non-binary.
Where were you eligible or are you eligible for free and reduced lunch programs while growing up?
Yes.
What level of education did your parents complete?
Depends on the parent, but genuinely my birth parent just went through high school.
Okay. And then what kinds of responsibilities did you have after school? I feel like you kind of already touched on this, but
Um, oh, so like meaning like my day-to-day life.
yeah.
Yeah. Sometimes I would like take care of my little siblings, or organizing or
Mhm. Awesome. Thank you. The last couple questions are a bit strange. Let me stop the recording.